In the darkest hours of the Second World War, the fate of civilization rested on a grim, unforgiving expanse of water, the North Atlantic. By 1941, Nazi Germany was the master of Europe. Britain stood alone, a final bastion against tyranny. But an island nation cannot fight without supplies. Food, fuel, guns, tanks, and the raw materials of war all had to make the treacherous journey from North America. This was the Atlantic lifeline. And it was bleeding. Winston Churchill, a man not given to overstatement, would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." He knew that every ship that slipped beneath the waves was a blow to Britain's heart. The convoys, vast flotillas of merchant vessels, plodded across the ocean at the speed of their slowest ship, protected by a handful of overworked destroyers and corvettes. For the men of the merchant navy, every voyage was a gamble with death. They were civilians, yet they were on the front line of the most vital battle of the war. They sailed with the constant, gnawing fear of the unseen enemy below, the German Unterseeboot. In the center of this vast ocean lay a region of profound dread, a place beyond the reach of land-based air cover. The Allies called it the Black Pit. The Germans called it paradise. Here, the U-boats were the masters, the apex predators in a kingdom of cold water and fear. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a single event, but a relentless, grinding campaign of attrition that lasted from the first day of the war to the last. And in its early years, the Allies were losing. The architect of Britain's misery was a stern, brilliant German naval officer, Admiral Karl Donitz. He had been a U-boat commander in the First World War and understood submarine warfare with an almost intuitive genius. He dismissed the old methods of lone submarines hunting individual ships. His strategy was one of cold, calculated teamwork. He called it, brutal tactic, the wolfpack. Donitz's U-boats were not true submarines in the modern sense. They were submersible torpedo boats. They were slow and clumsy underwater, but on the surface, powered by powerful diesel engines, they were faster than most of the convoy escorts. His doctrine was simple and brutal. Spread the boats out in a long patrol line across the convoy routes. When one boat spotted a convoy, it would not attack. It would shadow the target, reporting its position back to headquarters. Donitz, from his command center in France, would then vector every available U-boat in the area to converge on the hapless ships. They would wait for the cover of darkness. Then, they would surface together, a pack of wolves descending on a herd of sheep. Attacking on the surface at night, they were low in the water, incredibly difficult to spot, and their speed gave them the advantage. They would slip inside the convoy's defensive screen, launch their torpedoes with devastating accuracy, and then vanish back into the blackness. To the Allied sailors, it was a waking nightmare. Explosions would light up the night sky, one ship after another consumed by fire and smoke. The escorts would race about, dropping depth charges blindly into the depths, while the real killers were on the surface, silently selecting their next victim. In 1942, during the so-called Second Happy Time, Donitz's wolfpacks sent over 6 million tons of Allied shipping to the bottom of the sea. The Atlantic lifeline was being severed, and the wolf was at the door. The Allies were not idle. They threw everything they had at the U-boat menace. But their weapons were tragically inadequate for the challenge. Their primary anti-submarine tool was ASDIC, an early form of sonar. The name was an acronym for the Anti-Submarine Detection Investigation Committee. ASDIC worked by sending a ping of sound through the water and listening for an echo from a submerged object. Against a submerged U-boat, it could be effective, giving an escort a target for its depth charges. But Donitz's wolfpacks, attacking on the surface at night, rendered ASDIC almost useless. It was like trying to spot a low-flying aircraft with an underwater microphone. It simply could not detect a surfaced submarine. That left the oldest detection system of all, the human eye. Lookouts, bundled against the freezing spray and biting wind, spent countless hours scanning the horizon. But in the vast, gray emptiness of the Atlantic, on a dark night or in a thick fog, a tiny U-boat conning tower was virtually invisible beyond a few hundred yards. The odds were impossibly long. The other great hope was air power. Aircraft could spot surfaced U-boats and force them to submerge, where they were slow and blind. But in the early 1940s, aircraft simply didn't have the range. Patrols from Britain, Iceland, and Newfoundland could cover the coastal areas, but in the middle of the Atlantic, there was a vast, 1,000-mile-wide stretch of ocean that no Allied aircraft could reach. This was the Mid-Atlantic Gap, or the Black Pit. Once a convoy entered this zone, it was on its own, blind and vulnerable. Donitz knew this well, and he concentrated his wolfpacks there. The Allies were fighting a technologically superior foe in its element. Their tactics were defensive, their technology was outdated, and their losses were catastrophic. They were in a desperate race for a solution, any solution, before the lifeline snapped completely. While sailors died in the frozen Atlantic, another battle was being fought in the quiet of laboratories and classrooms. It was a battle of intellects, a race to invent a weapon that could see in the dark. The story of this breakthrough begins in the summer of 1940, when Britain, facing imminent invasion, made a momentous decision. Sir Henry Tizard, a leading British scientist, led a top-secret mission to the still neutral United States. Their cargo was not gold, but secrets, Britain's entire portfolio of advanced military research. In what became known as the Tizard mission, the British handed over jet engine designs, proximity fuses, and countless other innovations. But deep within their black box of treasures was one device that would change the course of the war: the cavity magnetron. Invented by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham, it was a deceptively simple-looking piece of finned copper. But it was a miracle of engineering. It could generate powerful pulses of microwave energy on a wavelength of just 10 centimeters. This was the key to creating a radar system small enough, light enough, and precise enough to be truly effective. Radar, an acronym for radio detection and ranging, was not a new concept. It worked on a simple principle: send out a pulse of radio energy and listen for the echo. The time it takes for the echo to return reveals the distance to the object. But existing radar systems were large, cumbersome, and used long wavelengths, which produced fuzzy, imprecise results. The magnetron was the missing piece. It was 1,000 times more powerful than the best American equivalent and operated at a frequency no one thought possible for a compact device. When American scientists first saw it, they were stunned into silence. Here, in this small metal puck, was the potential to build a ghost hunter, a machine that could pierce the fog, the storms, and the darkness of the Atlantic and see the unseeable. The arrival of the Tizard mission and its revolutionary magnetron lit a fire under the American scientific community. The United States, on the brink of entering the war, mobilized its immense industrial and intellectual resources. In October 1940, a new, secretive organization was founded at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the MIT Radiation Laboratory, or RAD Lab. It had nothing to do with nuclear radiation. Radiation referred to electromagnetic waves. Under the leadership of physicist Lee DeBridge, the RAD Lab became the epicenter of Allied radar development. It was a civilian organization, a place where scientists in shirt sleeves, not uniforms, worked with an urgency born of patriotism and intellectual challenge. The brightest minds in physics and engineering flocked to its doors. They were given a seemingly impossible task: take the British laboratory prototype, the cavity magnetron, and weaponize it. Turn this delicate scientific instrument into a rugged, reliable piece of military hardware that could be mass-produced by the thousands and operated by ordinary soldiers, sailors, and airmen in the heat of battle. The RAD Lab was a whirlwind of frantic, creative energy. Teams worked around the clock, tackling 1,000 different problems at once. Designing better antennas, creating more sensitive receivers, and, crucially, developing new ways to display the radar information so a human operator could make sense of the ghostly blips on a screen. This wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about creating an entirely new field of technology from the ground up, under the immense pressure of a global war. The work was top secret, the stakes were unimaginably high, and the clock was ticking. Every day of delay was measured in sunken ships and lost lives. In the quiet halls of MIT, the invisible weapon that would defeat the Wolfpack was beginning to take shape. The first priority was getting radar into the air. A patrol aircraft could scan 1,000 times more ocean than a ship, but it faced a unique challenge: size and weight. Early radar sets were massive, room-sized installations. The engineers at the RAD lab and their British counterparts had to perform a miracle of miniaturization. The first airborne radar to be widely deployed was the British ASV Mark II. ASV stood for Air-to-Surface Vessel. It was a long-wave system, not the advanced microwave radar the magnetron would later enable, but it was a crucial first step. It was a bulky, temperamental beast, and cramming it into the already cramped fuselage of a patrol bomber like the Consolidated Catalina or the Armstrong Whitworth Whitley was a monumental task. The operator sat hunched over a small cathode ray tube, a primitive screen that glowed with an eerie green light. What he saw was not a clear picture, but a sweeping line of light. When the radar beam hit an object on the surface, a blip would appear on the line. To an untrained eye, it was just a smudge of light. But to a skilled operator, that blip was a ship. Or, if it was small and isolated, it was a surfaced U-boat. For the first time, an aircraft could detect a submarine from miles away, through cloud cover or the black of night. The initial successes were stunning. Aircraft that would have previously flown over a U-boat without ever seeing it were now turning directly towards it. The U-boat crews, accustomed to owning the night, were suddenly being hunted. However, the system was imperfect. While the radar could guide the aircraft to the U-boat's general location, its resolution was poor. In the final, critical moments of the attack, the radar blip would merge with the sea clutter on the screen, becoming indistinct. The pilot was left flying blind, relying on luck to spot the dark shape of the submarine in the waves below. The problem of the final attack run was maddening. The ASV radar was a brilliant bloodhound, leading the hunter to the prey. But at the moment of the kill, the hunter was blindfolded. A U-boat could hear the approaching aircraft and would crash dive, disappearing beneath the waves in less than a minute. The bomber would arrive to find only empty ocean. The solution came not from a scientist in a lab, but from an officer in the Royal Air Force, Squadron Leader Humphrey de Verde-Lee. He had been pondering the problem for months. Flares were used, but they were often inaccurate and illuminated the attacker as much as the target. What was needed was a way to turn night into day at the precise moment it was needed. Lee's idea was both simple and audacious: mount a massive, controllable searchlight under the aircraft. It was a 22 million candela carbon arc lamp, an incredibly powerful beam linked to an electric motor and controlled by the aircraft's gunner. The concept was elegant. The radar operator would guide the aircraft towards the target in total darkness. As they closed to within a mile, the U-boat's position would be fixed. Then, with the flip of a switch, the Lee light would ignite, instantly illuminating the submarine in a brilliant circle of light. The U-boat crew, their night vision destroyed, would be completely blinded and disoriented. At the same moment, the bomber's pilot, who had been flying on instruments, would have his target perfectly painted for him, ready for a textbook depth charge attack. Initially, the Air Ministry was skeptical, dismissing the idea. Undeterred, Lee developed it privately. But once demonstrated, its devastating potential was undeniable. The Lee light was the perfect partner for ASV radar. The invisible beam would find the target, and the brilliant beam would fix it for the kill. The hunter was no longer blind. The first operational success of the ASV radar and Lee light combination came on the night of June 5, 1942. A Vickers-Wellington bomber of RAF Coastal Command was on patrol over the Bay of Biscay, a stretch of water U-boats had to cross to get from their bases in France to the Atlantic hunting grounds. For the U-boat crews, it was supposed to be a rest cure, a relatively safe transit. On his radar screen, the operator saw the telltale blip. The U-boat was U-502, surfaced and recharging its batteries under the cover of what it thought was impenetrable darkness. The Wellington began its approach, engines throttled back to reduce noise, flying low over the waves. The German lookouts saw and heard nothing. Inside the submarine, the crew was relaxed. Then, from a distance of half a mile, the Wellington pilot switched on the Lee light. In an instant, the U-boat and the sea around it were bathed in a light brighter than day. Panic erupted on the conning tower. The captain screamed orders to crash dive, but it was too late. The men were blinded, confused. For the British pilot, the submarine was laid bare, a perfect silhouette. He coolly lined up his attack and released a stick of 4 depth charges. They landed perfectly, bracketing the submarine. U-502 was blown to the surface, and then sank for the last time, taking all hands with it. The news sent a shockwave through the U-boat fleet. Crews returning to base told terrifying stories of being attacked out of a black and empty sky. Suddenly, the darkness was no longer a shield, it was a death trap. The Bay of Biscay was no longer a rest cure. The psychological impact was immense. The hunters had become the hunted, stalked by an enemy they could not see, who could turn night into day at will. The balance of power in the Atlantic night was beginning to shift. Admiral Donitz and his staff were baffled by the sudden, sharp increase in U-boat losses, particularly at night and in areas previously considered safe. The stories from surviving crews all had a common, terrifying theme: the sudden appearance of an aircraft and a blinding light, with no warning. It didn't take German intelligence long to deduce that the Allies were using some form of radio detection. The cat-and-mouse game of technology and counter-technology was now fully underway. German engineers quickly developed a countermeasure. It was a radar detector, a simple radio receiver designed to pick up the specific frequencies used by the Allied ASV radar. The device was officially designated the Fu MB-1, but it was universally known by its manufacturer's name, Metox. It was a crude-looking affair, with a simple wooden cross antenna that had to be manually pointed by a lookout. The Biscay Cross, as it was called, would be mounted on the conning tower when the U-boat surfaced. The receiver in the control room would emit a ticking sound when it detected radar pulses. The closer the aircraft, the faster the ticking. For the U-boat crews, Metox was a lifesaver. It gave them the one thing they desperately needed: a warning. They could hear the enemy's radar long before the aircraft was in visual range or close enough to attack. The ticking sound became the new rhythm of life on a surfaced U-boat. As soon as it started, the order would be given to crash dive. The advantage swung back. Allied pilots on patrol would get a radar contact, begin their approach, and then, frustratingly, the blip would vanish from their screen as the U-boat slipped beneath the waves. For a time, it seemed the wolfpack had found its shield against the invisible hunter. The U-boat crews breathed a collective sigh of relief, believing they had once again mastered the darkness. The Allied intelligence services quickly realized the Germans had deployed a radar detector. The sharp drop in successful night attacks was undeniable. The technological chess match had reached a critical point. But the Allied scientists, particularly the brilliant minds at the MIT Rad Lab, were already 2 moves ahead. They had anticipated this exact scenario. They knew that the long-wave ASV radar, operating at a frequency of 1.7 meters, was relatively easy to detect. The real ace up their sleeve was the weapon they had been perfecting ever since the Tizard mission delivered the cavity magnetron. This was the new generation of radar, microwave radar. Operating on a wavelength of just 10 centimeters, S-band, and later even 3 centimeters, X-band, its radio waves were far shorter and more powerful. This high-frequency radar had 2 enormous advantages. First, its short wavelength allowed for much smaller antennas and components, making it easier to fit into aircraft. More importantly, it produced a much sharper, more precise image on the radar screen, allowing operators to distinguish a U-boat from sea clutter with far greater accuracy. The second, and most decisive, advantage was one of stealth. The German Metox receiver was designed to listen for the 1.7-meter wavelength. It was completely deaf to the new 10-centimeter frequency. An aircraft equipped with the new centimetric radar was, for all intents and purposes, invisible to a U-boat's electronic senses. The Allies could now detect the U-boat, but the U-boat could not detect their detection. The trap was about to be reset, on a far grander and more lethal scale. While the Germans grew confident, believing their Metox sets gave them immunity, the Allies were secretly equipping hundreds of ships and long-range aircraft with this revolutionary new technology. The Hunter was about to put on a cloak of invisibility. The spring of 1943 marked the climax of the Battle of the Atlantic. Confident that his Metox detectors had neutralized the Allied air threat, Admiral Donitz launched the largest U-boat offensive of the war. He concentrated his wolfpacks in the mid-Atlantic gap, aiming for a knockout blow against the convoy routes. In the first 3 weeks of March alone, they sank nearly 100 ships. The Allied situation was desperate. It seemed Donitz was on the verge of victory. But the Germans were sailing into a perfectly laid trap. Unbeknownst to them, the Allies had spent the winter and spring in a frantic race to deploy their new secret weapon. The new, undetectable centimetric radar, designated ASV Mark III, was now installed in scores of very long-range Liberator bombers. Escort carriers, loaded with radar-equipped aircraft, were ready to sail with the convoys. And the escort ships themselves were being fitted with new, high-precision surface radar. The pieces were all in place. The confrontation came in May 1943. As Donitz's wolfpacks swarmed the convoy lanes, they were met by a new and terrifying reality. Out of the fog, out of the darkness, out of the overcast sky, Allied aircraft appeared with no warning. U-boats surfacing to attack convoys were themselves ambushed. Captains who relied on their METOX receivers for safety heard only silence before depth charges rained down from above. The hunters had become the hunted with shocking speed. The month would go down in the history of the German Kriegsmarine as Schwarzer Mai, Black May. It was a period of slaughter unlike anything they had ever experienced. The invisible weapon, wielded with skill and precision, was systematically dismantling Donitz's entire strategy. The tide of the Battle of the Atlantic was about to turn, not gradually, but with the brutal, sudden violence of a tidal wave. The new radar technology did more than just improve existing tactics, it enabled an entirely new, aggressive doctrine. For years, the Allies had been on the defensive, struggling simply to get the convoys through. The escorts were tied to the merchant ships, a thin shield against the wolves. Now, with the ability to find U-boats long before they could attack, the Allies could go on the offensive. This was the birth of the Hunter-Killer Group. The concept was revolutionary. A group of destroyers and corvettes, centered around a small escort carrier, would detach from the main convoy. Their mission was not to defend, but to actively hunt. The escort carrier, a jeep carrier, as they were nicknamed, was a mobile airbase. Its squadrons of Grumman Avenger and Wildcat aircraft, equipped with the new radar, could patrol hundreds of square miles of ocean around the clock. When a U-boat was detected, either by an aircraft or a ship's radar, the entire group would converge on the location. Aircraft would harry the submarine from the air, forcing it to stay submerged and depleting its batteries. Meanwhile, the surface escorts would arrive to conduct a deliberate, relentless depth charge attack. There was no escape. The Hunter-Killer Group was the physical embodiment of the new technological advantage. It took the fight to the enemy, turning the U-boat's own hunting grounds into a killing field. The wolves were now being stalked by a pack of their own, one that could see in the dark and strike from both the sea and the sky. This proactive strategy broke the back of the wolfpack system. No longer could U-boats gather and coordinate attacks without being detected and systematically destroyed. The initiative in the Atlantic had been permanently seized by the Allies. The statistics of Black May 1943 are stark and brutal. In that single month, the Allies sank 41 U-boats, a quarter of Donitz's entire frontline strength. In return, the U-boats managed to sink far fewer Allied ships than in previous months. The kill ratio had been catastrophically inverted. But statistics alone cannot capture the horror of what was happening to the U-boat crews. Consider the fate of U-461 on May 15. Surfaced at night, its METOX silent, it was suddenly illuminated by a lee light from a Sunderland flying boat. The depth charges struck home, and the boat was sunk. U-273, caught on the surface by a Hudson bomber on May 19. The radar gave no warning. The crew had no time to dive. It vanished in a single, violent explosion. Day after day, the reports of lost boats flooded into Donitz's headquarters. For the men at sea, confidence evaporated and was replaced by raw terror. Every time they surfaced, they were rolling the dice. The sky, once a harmless void at night, was now filled with an unseen, all-seeing menace. The psychological toll was devastating. The elite U-boat arm, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was being systematically butchered. Seasoned captains and veteran crews who had survived for years were now being lost on their first patrol out of port. The new generation of centimetric radar was so effective that U-boats were often detected and sunk before they had a chance to even fire a torpedo. The wolfpacks, designed to be the hunters, had been turned into a school of fish being torn apart by sharks. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, an electronic ghost that was everywhere at once. The morale of the U-boat force, once sky-high, was completely shattered. In his command center in Germany, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz watched the daily reports with growing disbelief and horror. The master of the wolfpacks could not understand what was happening. His most experienced commanders were vanishing without a trace. The meticulous grid of patrol lines he had established across the Atlantic was being torn to shreds. He initially suspected improved Allied intelligence or a new type of listening device. The idea that the Allies had developed a radar that was invisible to Metox seemed impossible. His scientists had assured him it couldn't be done. On May 24, 1943, facing the loss of nearly a dozen boats in a single 48-hour period, Donitz made the most difficult decision of his career. He radioed his U-boats in the North Atlantic with a stark message. All boats in the North Atlantic still in contact with convoys are to break off immediately and proceed at high speed south out of the area. It was a retreat, a full-scale withdrawal. In his personal war diary, Donitz confessed his despair. "Our losses have reached an intolerable level," he wrote. "The enemy has rendered the U-boat weapon ineffective. He has achieved this object, not through superior tactics or strategy, but through his superiority in the field of science. The scientists have given him a weapon which enables him to find the U-boats by day and by night and to attack them." It was a stunning admission of defeat. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most critical campaign of the war, had been decided. While the U-boat war would continue in a diminished capacity until 1945, the strategic threat to the Allied lifeline was over. The Great Wolfpack Offensive was broken, shattered by an invisible weapon born in a British university and perfected in an American lab. Defeated in the surface war, the Germans scrambled for a technological counterpunch. They knew their only hope was to stay underwater, to make their submarines true submersibles, invisible to the all-seeing eye of radar. Their primary innovation was the schnorkel, a Dutch invention they adapted for their fleet. It was essentially a retractable air mast, a breathing tube that allowed a U-boat to run its powerful diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. This meant it could stay underwater for weeks at a time, recharging its batteries without having to risk surfacing. In theory, it was a brilliant solution. In practice, it turned the U-boat from a sleek surface predator into a sluggish, half-blind creature. Speed was drastically reduced, and the noise of the schnorkel mast cutting through the water, along with the diesel exhaust, made it easier to detect by sonar. Life inside a schnorkeling U-boat was a living hell of foul air, constant noise, and extreme claustrophobia. Alongside the schnorkel, the Germans introduced new weaponry, most notably the G7S Zonkonig torpedo. Nicknamed NAT by the Allies for German Naval Acoustic Torpedo, it was a technological marvel. It didn't need to be aimed directly at a ship, it would home in on the sound of its propellers. This was a deadly threat to the convoy escorts, whose job was to be noisy and aggressive. Allied commanders quickly developed countermeasures, such as a towed noise-making device called a Foxer, which would lure the acoustic torpedoes away from the ship's stern. These German innovations were clever and prolonged the U-boat war, causing significant Allied losses. But they were the tools of a force on the defensive. They could no longer win the battle, only delay the inevitable defeat. The fundamental strategic advantage had shifted permanently. The Allies owned the surface of the Atlantic, and there was no going back. The final piece of the puzzle in securing the Atlantic was the complete elimination of the U-boat's last sanctuary, the mid-Atlantic air gap. Even after Black May, this vast area remained difficult for aircraft to patrol consistently. The solution came in the form of a remarkable aircraft, the Very Long Range, or VLR, version of the American B-24 Liberator bomber. The Liberator was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering, with a long, slender wing that gave it incredible range and endurance. The VLR variants were stripped of excess weight, including armor and some machine guns, and packed with extra fuel tanks. They were not fighters, they were airborne sentinels. Stationed in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland, these VLR liberators, all equipped with the latest centimetric radar, could fly for over 16 hours. Their patrol routes were carefully plotted to overlap, creating a continuous, unbroken chain of air cover across the entire North Atlantic. For the first time, there was literally nowhere left for a U-boat to hide. If a U-boat commander surfaced to charge his batteries or get a breath of fresh air, he did so under the constant threat of detection. The electronic eyes of the liberators were always watching. The closing of the air gap was the strategic checkmate. It ensured that the immense flotillas of ships needed for the D-Day invasion could cross the Atlantic unmolested. The logistical buildup in Britain, the greatest in military history, was made possible because the U-boat threat had been neutralized. The victory was a testament not just to the radar itself, but to the seamless integration of technology, aircraft, and strategy. The black pit had been illuminated, and the lifeline was secure. A single brilliant invention, like the cavity magnetron, does not win a war. Victory is achieved when that invention can be produced on an industrial scale and deployed across the entire theater of operations. The triumph over the U-boats was as much a victory for the factory floor as it was for the laboratory. While scientists at the RAD lab designed the circuits, it was the industrial might of the United States and Great Britain that turned blueprints into battlefield dominance. Companies like Raytheon, Bell Labs, and Western Electric retooled their production lines, churning out thousands upon thousands of sophisticated radar sets. It was a monumental undertaking. These were not simple devices, they were complex pieces of electronics, requiring precision engineering and skilled assembly. An army of workers, many of them women who had entered the workforce for the first time, were trained for this highly technical work. They became the unsung heroes of the Battle of the Atlantic, their hands building the eyes that would guide the hunters. And it wasn't just the radar sets. The system required aircraft to carry them, tens of thousands of Liberators, Catalinas, and Sunderlands. It required ships to mount them on, hundreds of new destroyers, corvettes, and escort carriers that slid down the slipways of American shipyards at a staggering rate. This was total war, a conflict of systems and production capacity. Germany, for all its engineering prowess, simply could not compete with the combined industrial output of the Allies. They could produce a few hundred U-boats a year. The Allies could produce thousands of aircraft and hundreds of ships. Technology provided the critical edge, but it was industry that provided the overwhelming, war-winning mass. Behind the diagrams, the strategies, and the technologies, this was a human story of endurance, courage, and immense suffering. We must never forget the men who fought this battle. The merchant mariners, who sailed on slow, vulnerable ships packed with explosives and fuel, knowing their chances of survival if torpedoed in the frigid Atlantic were slim. Over 30,000 of them would perish. The sailors of the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy on the escort ships, who endured relentless storms, mind-numbing fatigue, and the constant terror of a torpedo strike. They were the shepherds of the flock, and they paid a heavy price. The young airmen of Coastal Command in the U.S. Navy, flying grueling 12 or 14-hour patrols over a featureless, hostile ocean. They battled extreme weather, mechanical failures, and the gnawing loneliness of the long-range patrol, all for the fleeting chance of spotting a U-boat. And we must also acknowledge the men on the other side. The German U-boat crews were brave, highly skilled sailors who fought for their country. They went from being celebrated heroes, the elite hunters of the Reich, to being the hunted. Theirs was one of the most dangerous jobs in any military. Of the 40,000 men who served in the U-boat arm, nearly 30,000 never returned. A casualty rate of 75%. Technology like radar changed the odds, but it was these men who lived and died at the sharp end of the conflict. Their bravery and their sacrifice, on all sides, form the true, human legacy of the Battle of the Atlantic. During the war, radar was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Allies. The public knew of the battles, the ships, and the planes, but the invisible force that guided them remained hidden in the shadows of classified documents. When the war ended, that technology was unleashed upon the world, transforming civilian life in ways its creators could have never imagined. The most direct legacy is in the sky. Every time we fly, our safety depends on air traffic control, a system built entirely around radar. It's the descendant of the technology that hunted U-boats, which now prevents mid-air collisions and guides planes safely through storms. The same is true at sea. Every modern ship, from the largest container vessel to the smallest fishing boat, navigates with marine radar, piercing the fog and darkness just as the patrol bombers did decades ago. When a meteorologist on the evening news shows you an approaching storm front, they're using Doppler radar, another direct evolution of the wartime technology. And perhaps the most surprising legacy of this secret weapon of war sits in millions of kitchens around the world. The microwave oven is a direct result of the effort to mass-produce the cavity magnetron. A Raytheon engineer named Percy Spencer famously discovered its cooking potential when a chocolate bar in his pocket melted while he was standing near a radar set. From a weapon that sent men and machines to the bottom of the ocean came a device of domestic convenience. The silent victor of the Atlantic campaign continues to shape our modern world in countless, often invisible, ways. The battle is long over. The men who fought it are nearly all gone. The Atlantic is quiet now, its surface crossed by peaceful commerce. But deep on the seabed, in the cold, silent darkness, the evidence remains. More than 700 German U-boats lie on the ocean floor. They are silent tombs, ghostly monuments to a brutal conflict. For decades they were lost, but now, with modern technology, we can visit them. We see their steel hulls, crushed by the pressure of the depths and the violence of their end, slowly being reclaimed by the ocean. They are a stark reminder of a battle of wits and waves, of measure and countermeasure. A battle that threatened to starve an island and cripple the Allied war effort. It was a battle ultimately won not by a bigger gun or a faster ship, but by an intangible weapon. A pulse of pure energy, sent out into the darkness, that allowed the Allies to see their enemy and secure the victory. The story of radar in the Battle of the Atlantic is a timeless lesson in the power of technological surprise, and a tribute to the scientists who armed the hunters, and the servicemen who wielded their invisible sword to save the world.